The banner stretched across her small frame like a contradiction that made no sense. "I love Jesus, hug or slap," blazed across the bright yellow fabric in bold black letters, held high above the crowd at the packed Chicago Convention Center. But it wasn't the confusing message that made Jonathan Roumie stop mid-sentence during his inspirational speech. It wasn't even the way she stood there, perfectly still while everyone else was seated. It was the look in her eyes when he finally noticed her, a look that said she knew something about him that no one else in that room of 2,000 people could possibly know. Jonathan's words died in his throat as he stared at the young woman holding the banner. His practiced smile faltered, his confident posture shifted, and for the first time in hundreds of speaking events, the man who portrayed Jesus Christ looked genuinely rattled. The audience began to murmur, turning to see what had captured their speaker's attention so completely. But Jonathan couldn't look away from her face, couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had been orchestrated by forces beyond his understanding. "I love Jesus, hug or slap?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, like a mirror being held up to his soul. Most people would have seen it as the confused statement of someone struggling with faith, but Jonathan saw something else entirely. He saw a test, a moment of truth that he'd been running from for 3 years. The banner wasn't about Jesus at all, it was about him, about the choice he'd been avoiding, about the secret he'd been carrying that was slowly eating him alive from the inside. The young woman holding the banner didn't move, didn't chant, didn't create any disturbance. She simply stood there, her eyes locked on Jonathan's, waiting for his response. And in that electric moment of silence, Jonathan realized that everything he thought he knew about faith, about authenticity, about the weight of representing Christ to the world, was about to be challenged in ways he never could have imagined. What happened next would reveal why Jonathan Roumie had been carrying a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket for 3 years, why he'd never spoken publicly about his deepest spiritual struggle, and why this young woman's simple banner would force him to make a choice that would change everything. The question, hug or slap, wasn't about Jesus, it was about whether Jonathan was finally ready to embrace the truth he'd been running from, or continue living a lie that was slowly destroying his soul. If you've ever wondered what it takes for someone to finally face their deepest fears, make sure you subscribe because this story will show you the incredible moment when hiding becomes impossible and truth becomes the only way forward. And in the comments below, tell us about a time when a simple question changed everything for you. We read every single one, and your story might inspire someone else who's struggling with their own moment of truth. Her name was Emma Chin, and she wasn't supposed to be there. 3 days earlier, she'd been sitting in her apartment in Milwaukee, staring at a newspaper article about Jonathan Roumie's upcoming speaking event in Chicago, when something clicked in her mind that changed everything. Emma was a grief counselor who specialized in helping people process loss and trauma, and she'd been following Jonathan's career not as a fan of The Chosen, but as someone who recognized the signs of deep, unprocessed pain hiding behind a public persona. Emma had lost her twin sister Sarah in a hiking accident 2 years ago, and in the months that followed, she'd become obsessed with understanding how people carry grief while maintaining their public responsibilities. Sarah had been her closest friend, her spiritual mentor, and the person who'd introduced her to faith in the first place. When Sarah died, Emma's world shattered, but what broke her even more was the way everyone expected her to move on and find peace, as if grief had an expiration date. The newspaper article about Jonathan's speech had included a small photo of him from a recent interview, and Emma's trained eye immediately caught something that made her heart race. It was the same expression she'd seen in her own mirror for months after Sarah's death, the look of someone carrying a secret burden so heavy it was changing the shape of their soul. She'd seen it in dozens of her clients, the way people's faces held hidden pain even when they were smiling, especially when they were smiling. But Emma saw something else in that photograph that made her cancel her appointments and drive 4 hours to Chicago. There was a specific kind of grief in Jonathan's eyes that she'd only seen in one type of person, someone who'd lost their faith at the exact moment they needed it most. Someone who was living a contradiction so profound it was slowly killing them from the inside. Someone who was portraying Jesus while secretly wondering if God had abandoned them completely. Emma had spent her career helping people face the truths they were afraid to acknowledge, and she'd developed an almost supernatural ability to see through the masks people wore to hide their pain. She'd learned that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone was to hold up a mirror to their soul and force them to see what they'd been avoiding. The banner she'd made wasn't random, it was surgical, designed to cut through years of carefully constructed defenses with a single, impossible question. Standing in the back of that auditorium, Emma watched Jonathan deliver his speech about faith and hope with the same practiced perfection she'd seen in his interviews. But her eyes were trained on his tells, the way he touched his jacket pocket when he mentioned prayer, the micropause before he said the word Jesus, the slight tremor in his voice when he talked about trusting God's plan. She'd seen enough broken people to know that Jonathan Roumie was living in a prison of his own making, and she'd come to Chicago to offer him the key. When she finally stood up and raised her banner, Emma wasn't thinking about the audience or the cameras or the disruption she was causing. She was thinking about every client she'd ever helped, every person who'd found freedom on the other side of truth, and every moment of her own healing journey when someone had cared enough to refuse to let her hide. The banner was her gift to Jonathan. A chance to stop pretending, stop performing, and finally deal with whatever was slowly destroying him from the inside. Jonathan's feet felt like they were moving through quicksand as he walked toward Emma and her impossible banner. The auditorium had fallen into a silence so complete that his footsteps echoed like gunshots against the polished floor. 2,000 people watched in stunned fascination as their composed, confident speaker transformed before their eyes into someone who looked like he was walking toward his own execution. When he finally reached Emma, standing just 20 feet away from her now, she lowered the banner and spoke the words that would haunt him forever. 3 years ago, you stopped believing, she said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for the front rows to hear. But you kept playing Jesus anyway. And it's killing you, isn't it? The words hit Jonathan like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. His carefully constructed facade cracked completely, and for a moment, he looked like a man who'd been caught in the act of a crime he'd spent years trying to cover up. The color drained from Jonathan's face as he stared at Emma in disbelief. How could this stranger know what he'd never told anyone? How could she see through walls that he'd spent 3 years building, brick by brick, speech by speech, interview by interview? His hand instinctively moved to his jacket pocket, to the folded piece of paper that had become his talisman of shame, his reminder of the moment when his faith had died and his acting had begun. I don't know what you're talking about, Jonathan whispered, but his voice betrayed him completely. The lie sounded hollow even to his own ears, and Emma's expression softened with the kind of compassion that made his chest ache. She'd seen through him completely, and somehow, instead of feeling exposed, he felt the first stirring of something he hadn't experienced in years: relief. Emma took a step closer, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged with hard-won wisdom. You carry a letter in your pocket, she said, and Jonathan's eyes widened in shock. A letter from someone who trusted you with their faith, someone who believed in you completely. And when they died, your faith died with them. But you couldn't tell anyone because millions of people were counting on you to be their connection to Jesus. The accuracy of her words sent shockwaves through Jonathan's entire body. He felt his knees weaken, felt his carefully controlled breathing become ragged, felt the walls he'd built around his heart begin to crumble. Around them, the audience leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would change them all. Cell phones came out, recording what was clearly becoming a moment that would be talked about for years to come. How do you know? Jonathan asked, his voice breaking on the question. How could you possibly know about? He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't bring himself to acknowledge the truth that Emma had somehow pulled from the depths of his soul. The letter in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, Marcus's final words echoing in his mind like a prayer he could no longer believe. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she watched the man who'd brought Jesus to life for millions of people finally begin to break apart. Because I know what it looks like when someone's faith dies but their responsibility to others lives on, she said gently. I know what it costs to keep pretending everything is fine when your soul is screaming that God has abandoned you. And I know that you've been carrying this alone for too long. The moment stretched between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and Jonathan realized that Emma hadn't come to expose him or destroy him. She'd come to save him. The banner, the public confrontation, the surgical precision of her words, it was all an act of mercy from someone who understood that sometimes the only way to heal is to stop hiding and start telling the truth. With trembling hands, Jonathan slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper that had been folded and refolded so many times it was beginning to tear at the creases. The entire auditorium held its breath as he unfolded it with the reverence of someone handling something sacred. His voice cracked as he began to read the words that had haunted him for 3 years. Dear Jonathan, my name is Marcus Chin, and I'm writing this from my hospital bed because the doctors say I don't have much time left. I'm 19 years old, and I want you to know that watching you portray Jesus in The Chosen saved my soul. Jonathan's voice broke completely, and he had to pause before continuing. The auditorium was dead silent except for the sound of people quietly crying. Emma's face went white as she heard her twin brother's name spoken aloud. The connection she'd felt to Jonathan, the inexplicable knowledge she'd had about his pain, suddenly made perfect sense. She'd been carrying her own version of this same letter in her heart for 3 years. I'm not afraid to die because your Jesus taught me that death isn't the beginning of the end, it's the beginning of forever, Jonathan continued reading. I'm writing this because I need you to promise me something. Promise me that you'll never stop believing in the hope you've given to people like me. Your friend in Christ, Marcus Chin. Jonathan looked up at Emma, understanding flooding his eyes. You're Marcus's sister, he whispered, and Emma nodded, unable to speak through her tears. This letter arrived 3 days after he died, Jonathan said, his voice raw with emotion. And I couldn't understand how God could let someone with such pure faith die so young. How could I keep playing Jesus when I'd lost all hope myself? Emma stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 3 years learning to live with loss. Marcus didn't write that letter to burden you, she said loud enough for everyone to hear. He wrote it to free you. He wrote it because he knew that the Jesus you portrayed was real, even when your faith wasn't perfect. He wrote it because he understood that God uses broken people to heal other broken people. The transformation in Jonathan's posture was visible to everyone watching. Marcus's letter hadn't been a test of his faith, it had been proof that his faith was working even when he couldn't feel it. Jonathan stood in the center of that auditorium, Marcus's letter still clutched in his shaking hands, facing the most important decision of his life. The weight of 3 years of hidden grief, doubt, and spiritual darkness pressed down on him like a physical force. Around him, 2,000 people waited in breathless silence, their phones recording every moment of his breakdown and potential breakthrough. Emma watched him with the same intensity she'd carried when she first stood up with her banner, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether Jonathan would finally embrace healing or retreat back into his carefully constructed prison. I can't do this anymore, Jonathan whispered, his voice barely audible but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent auditorium. I can't keep pretending to have faith when mine died with Marcus. I can't keep playing Jesus when I'm not even sure God exists anymore. The confession hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded, shattering the image that millions of people had of the man who'd brought their savior to life on screen. Emma took another step closer, her voice gentle but firm. Then don't, she said, and the simplicity of her words hit Jonathan like lightning. Don't pretend. Don't perform. Don't carry this alone anymore. But also don't let your doubt erase the truth that Marcus saw in you. Don't let your questions cancel out the hope you've given to people like him. The banner that had started it all lay forgotten on the floor between them, its message, I love Jesus, hug or slap, now seeming like a prophecy that had been fulfilled. Jonathan realized that for 3 years he'd been choosing to slap away his faith instead of embracing the mystery of how God could use a broken, doubting man to bring healing to others. The choice Emma was offering him wasn't between faith and doubt, it was between isolation and community, between hiding and healing, between shame and purpose. Marcus's faith didn't die with him, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. It's alive in every person who found hope through your work. It's alive in every family who watched The Chosen together. It's alive in every person in this room who's been changed by seeing Jesus through your eyes. Your doubt doesn't diminish that, it proves that God's power is made perfect in our weakness. Jonathan looked out at the faces surrounding him, seeing them not as an audience but as a community of people who'd been willing to witness his most vulnerable moment. For the first time in 3 years, he felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. Not the easy hope of unquestioned faith, but the deeper hope of knowing that God could use even his brokenness for something beautiful. "What if I keep doubting?" Jonathan asked, his voice stronger now but still fragile. "What if I never get my faith back the way it was before?" Emma smiled through her tears, and her answer would become the turning point that transformed not just Jonathan's life, but the lives of everyone listening. "Then you'll be exactly the kind of Jesus that people like Marcus need," she said. "A Jesus who understands what it's like to feel abandoned by God. A Jesus who knows what it's like to question everything while still choosing love. A Jesus who's not afraid to be human." The words hit Jonathan like a revelation, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt the pieces of his shattered faith beginning to rearrange themselves into something new, something stronger, something real. If you've ever wondered whether God can use your doubts and questions for something beautiful, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will show you the incredible power of choosing vulnerability over perfection. And in the comments, share a time when your biggest struggle became your greatest strength. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Jonathan slowly walked to where Emma's banner lay crumpled on the floor and picked it up, holding it high enough for everyone to see. "I love Jesus, hug or slap?" he read aloud, his voice now steady with newfound purpose. "For 3 years, I've been choosing to slap away my faith because I was angry that God let Marcus die. But Marcus didn't write that letter to make me perfect, he wrote it to remind me that Jesus loves broken people." The transformation in Jonathan's demeanor was visible to everyone watching. The weight of shame that had bent his shoulders for 3 years was lifting, replaced by something that looked like freedom. He turned to face Emma, holding Marcus's letter against his heart. "Your brother saved my faith twice," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. "Once when he was alive, and once today through you." Emma wiped her tears and stepped forward, her voice filled with the authority of someone who just witnessed a miracle. "Marcus always said that the most beautiful thing about Jesus was that he chose to suffer with us, not just for us. He didn't need perfect faith to see that in your portrayal. He needed someone who understood what it felt like to question God while still choosing to love people." Jonathan looked out at the audience, seeing faces wet with tears, people leaning forward as if they were witnessing something sacred. "I thought I had to have all the answers to play Jesus," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But maybe the only qualification I really needed was to know what it feels like to be human. To doubt, to grieve, to feel abandoned, and to somehow still choose hope." The auditorium erupted in applause, but it wasn't the polite clapping of a typical speaking event. It was the sound of people who just witnessed someone choose healing over hiding, truth over performance, vulnerability over perfection. Emma smiled through her tears as she watched Jonathan fold Marcus's letter carefully and place it back in his jacket pocket, no longer as a burden of shame, but as a reminder of how God uses broken people to heal other broken people. "This is what Marcus would have wanted," Emma said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not for you to be perfect, but for you to be real. Not for you to have all the answers, but for you to keep asking the questions. And not for you to carry this alone anymore, but for you to let his love and God's love work through your beautiful brokenness." Jonathan nodded, understanding flooding his eyes as he realized that his 3-year journey through the dark night of the soul hadn't been a detour from his calling, it had been preparation for it. The Jesus he would portray now wouldn't be the Jesus of easy answers and perfect faith, but the Jesus who wept, who questioned, who felt forsaken, and who somehow still chose to love until the very end. 6 months later, Jonathan Roumie stood on the set of The Chosen's final season, but everything had changed. The scene they were filming was Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and as Jonathan spoke the words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" there was a rawness, an authenticity that made the entire crew stop and stare. The doubt he'd carried for 3 years hadn't disappeared, it had been transformed into the very thing that made his portrayal of Christ more powerful than ever before. Emma had started a nonprofit called Marcus's Hope, helping people navigate faith during seasons of loss and doubt. The video of that night in Chicago had gone viral, watched by millions of people who found comfort in seeing that even someone who played Jesus could struggle with faith and still find their way back to hope. The comments section became a sanctuary where people shared their own stories of doubt, loss, and the slow journey back to believing. But the most profound change wasn't in what Jonathan or Emma did, it was in how their story gave millions of people permission to be honest about their own struggles. Churches began hosting doubt and faith support groups, where people could ask hard questions without judgment. Pastors started preaching about the holiness of honest questions, and families began having conversations about faith that included space for uncertainty and growth. Jonathan still carried Marcus's letter in his jacket pocket, but now he also carried hundreds of others, letters from people who'd found hope in his vulnerability, who'd discovered that broken faith could be more powerful than perfect faith, who'd learned that God's love was big enough to handle their biggest questions. The man who'd almost quit playing Jesus because he'd lost his faith had become the most authentic portrayal of Christ the world had ever seen. The banner that had started it all, "I love Jesus, hug or slap?" now hung framed in Emma's office, a reminder that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from having all the answers, but from having the courage to ask the hardest questions. And every time someone walked into that office carrying their own burden of doubt or loss, they would see those words and remember that faith isn't about perfection, it's about choosing love even when nothing makes sense. As Jonathan wrapped filming that final scene, he realized that Marcus's prayer had been answered in ways the young man never could have imagined. He'd asked Jonathan to never stop believing in hope, and through his doubt, through his questions, through his willingness to be broken in public, Jonathan had given hope to more people than he ever had when his faith was perfect and his answers were easy. The story of that night in Chicago became a testament to the mysterious ways that God works through our deepest wounds to create our greatest gifts. And perhaps the most beautiful part was that it all started with 7 words from a stranger who cared enough to refuse to let someone suffer alone. "I know what you're hiding from us." If this story has shown you that your doubts and questions might be exactly what someone else needs to hear, make sure you're subscribed because your vulnerability could be the key that unlocks someone else's healing. And in the comments below, share how this story has changed your perspective on faith, doubt, and the beautiful mess of being human, because your words might be exactly what someone else needs to finally stop hiding and start healing.